Have you ever watched the person who gave you life try to strip it away on the most important day of your existence? I am Liliana Perez. I am 29 years old, and I spend my days in a glass office in downtown Boston auditing financial fraud. I track missing numbers and uncover the lies people tell to protect their status. But the most staggering deficit I ever traced was in my mother's capacity to love me. On the morning of my wedding, I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the country club bridal suite, holding a tray of coffees. The room smelled of chilled champagne and expensive hairspray. I stopped just over the threshold. Standing on the circular velvet pedestal, positioned perfectly in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, was my cousin Vanessa. She was wearing my wedding dress. It was a custom piece of ivory silk I had commissioned months prior, featuring a sweeping train and hand-stitched beadwork designed to catch the morning light. My mother Sylvia knelt behind Vanessa, carefully smoothing the fabric over her waist. Neither of them flinched when the door clicked shut. Vanessa merely tilted her head, admiring her own profile in the glass, and took a slow sip from her mimosa. My mother stood up, brushed the lint from her knees, and walked over to a metal folding chair in the corner. She picked up a clear plastic garment bag and carried it toward me. Inside hung an off-the-rack polyester shift. The red clearance sticker still dangled from the zipper pull. "You are marrying a man who plays in the dirt, Liliana," my mother said. Her voice was smooth and unbothered as she pressed the plastic bag against my chest. "Vanessa is marrying a neurosurgeon. The society photographer from the Globe is coming to her fitting next week. She needs this piece to set the right tone. The dress in your hands will do fine for a backyard affair." I did not drop the coffee tray. I did not scream or demand an explanation. In my line of work, when you uncover a fraudulent transfer, a tantrum serves no purpose. You simply secure the evidence and follow the paper trail down to the root of the rot. I looked at the cheap synthetic fabric, then at the intricate silk draped over my cousin. My mother thought she was managing an unruly asset. She failed to realize I was already drafting the terms of her bankruptcy. Welcome back to Revenge Order, where the people who expect you to shrink so they can shine realize too late that you own the bank. How old were you when you first noticed your family treated love like a transaction? Drop your age in the comments and hit subscribe, because the financial takedown in this story will leave you breathless. Now let me take you back 6 months, to the dinner where my family first calculated my fiancé's worth and the precise moment I decided to let them dig their own graves. The joint engagement dinner took place on a rainy Tuesday at my Aunt Beatrice's sprawling Wellesley estate. Beatrice and my mother had spent 30 years cultivating a flawless high society facade. The dining room table was set with heavy silver and crystal water goblets that cast prisms across the linen cloth. Vanessa sat beside her fiancé, Dr. Pierce, the prominent neurosurgeon, and the undisputed crown jewel of our family's social ambition. Pierce spent the first course adjusting his Rolex and detailing his upcoming country club golf tournament. Then there was my fiancé, Julian. Julian sat next to me in a crisp but unbranded button-down shirt. When Aunt Beatrice asked what he did for a living, Julian took a sip of his water and answered mildly, "I am a site manager for Vanguard Ecological." He had calloused hands, wore scuffed work boots, and spoke with quiet passion about soil health and structural root systems. To my mother and my aunt, he was a glorified gardener. Throughout the main course, Sylvia and Beatrice exchanged pointed looks. They worshipped surface aesthetics, blind to the concept of foundational stability. They did not bother to run a simple background check on Vanguard Ecological. If they had, they would have seen the nested corporate structure. Instead, they wrote Julian off as a blue-collar charity case. Pierce leaned over his plate, swirling a glass of Cabernet. "You know, Julian, the hospital is looking for a new head groundskeeper. I could put in a good word. Get you out of the mud." My mother hid a smirk behind her napkin. Julian set his fork down. He did not flush or raise his voice. He looked Pierce directly in the eye, offering a calm, terrifying smile. "I appreciate the offer, Pierce. I will be sure to look into your hospital's grounds." Pierce let out a short, nervous laugh. He was not accustomed to people failing to grovel at his feet. The doctors in his surgical ward bowed to his demands, and the women in our family treated his every utterance like gospel. Julian's quiet defiance disrupted the hierarchy. Vanessa immediately placed a hand on Pierce's arm, her diamond engagement ring catching the light of the dining room chandelier. She wore a silk slip dress that looked fragile next to the heavy, antique mahogany chairs. "Pierce is merely trying to be helpful, Julian," Vanessa said. Her tone dripped with a synthetic pity that coated the room like oil. "Not everyone has the intellect to be a surgeon. Someone has to maintain the grass. We all play our roles." My mother tightened her jaw. She shot a sharp, frantic look at Aunt Beatrice. These two women were the sole architects of their own reality. For 3 decades, they had orchestrated every social interaction, every charity gala attendance, and every zip code they inhabited. They grew up in a cramped duplex in Dorchester, raised by Abuela Carmen, a woman who scrubbed commercial office floors on the night shift to pay for their college tuitions. But Sylvia and Beatrice spent their adult lives trying to eradicate that history. They traded their working-class heritage for country club memberships, tennis skirts, and a relentless pursuit of status. Bringing a man with soil under his nails to their pristine dinner table was a direct threat to the facade they had constructed. To them, Julian was not a partner. He was a social regression. Sylvia stood up her chair, scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "Liliana, help me clear the plates," she commanded. It was not a request. I followed her through the swinging door into the kitchen. The space was a monument to unused wealth. White marble countertops stretched across the room. Dual stainless ovens sat untouched by any real cooking, and a built-in wine fridge glowed with a sterile blue light. As soon as the door swung shut behind us, my mother spun around. Her carefully curated composure fractured. "Are you trying to humiliate me in front of my sister?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the guests in the dining room would not hear. "Vanessa brings a top-tier medical professional into this family. You bring a man who smells like mulch. Did you see his boots? He wore scuffed leather to your aunt's home. He has no concept of decorum." I leaned against the cool marble island. "Julian manages ecological sites, Mom. He runs crews. He works outside assessing terrain." He did not wear a tuxedo to a Tuesday family dinner, because he is a practical man. "He is a laborer," she snapped. Her eyes darted down to my chest. For the first time all evening, she noticed the chain resting against my collarbone. Attached to it was a small, dull brass safety deposit key. Abuela Carmen had pressed it into my palm 3 days before her heart failed. My mother reached out and flicked the key with her manicured fingernail. The metal clinked against my sternum. "What is this cheap hardware? It ruins the neckline of your blouse. Take it off. You look like a janitor carrying around a master key." I stepped back, moving out of her reach. "It belonged to Abuela. I am wearing it." "Your grandmother held on to garbage because she did not know any better," Sylvia said, her voice turning venomous. "I spent my entire life making sure you would not have to dig through the dirt. And here you are, marrying a man who wallows in it, wearing brass trash around your neck. You are throwing away your potential." I did not argue with her. In forensic auditing, you let the suspect exhaust their rhetoric. The louder they yell, the more obvious their insecurity becomes. I tucked the key beneath the fabric of my blouse, feeling the cold metal against my skin, and walked back into the dining room. The ride home that night was quiet. Rain slicked the windshield of Julian's Ford truck. The cab smelled of cedar and rain, a scent that always grounded me. I watched the streetlights streak across the glass, feeling the lingering sting of the dinner. I opened my mouth to apologize for my family, but Julian spoke first. "Your aunt looks tired," he said, keeping his eyes on the wet road. I blinked, caught off guard by the observation. Tired. Beatrice spends 4 days a week at the spa. She has not worked a day since the 90s. Julian shook his head slightly. His hands rested easily on the steering wheel. Not physically tired, financially tired. "Did you notice the art in the dining room?" I frowned, recalling the ornate walls of the Wellesley estate, the landscape paintings. "They were reproductions," Julian said. "High quality, but the brushstrokes were too uniform to be originals. And the vintage Persian rug under the table, was replaced by a machine-loomed replica. You can tell by the fringe binding. I noticed things built from the ground up. They are liquidating their assets, Liliana. I stared at his profile in the dim light of the dashboard. Julian never flaunted his intellect, but he missed nothing. His business required him to assess structural integrity at a glance. He applied the same scrutiny to rooms full of people. Let them play their game, Julian added, his voice a low, steady anchor. People who boast about their roof usually have a cracked foundation. We just wait for the rain. The rain he predicted arrived a few weeks later in the form of a coordinated attack on our wedding plans. Aunt Beatrice summoned my mother Vanessa and me to the country club patio for a planning luncheon. We sat under striped umbrellas, sipping iced tea, while Beatrice laid out her grand design. Vanessa will take the grand ballroom here at the club for her reception, Beatrice announced, tapping a manicured finger against a leather-bound planner. It holds 300 guests. The crystal chandeliers will look stunning in the society photographs. Now, Liliana, we must discuss your arrangements. Beatrice folded her hands. A condescending smile touched the corners of her mouth. Given Julian's rustic tastes and your limited budget, the club is simply too formal for your event. But I am a generous woman. I will allow you to host your reception at my estate. You can use the detached glass conservatory in the backyard. I set my glass down. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal. The conservatory was an unheated greenhouse Beatrice used to overwinter her potted ferns. It had a gravel floor, poor lighting, and drafty window panes. Hosting a wedding reception there in late October was a calculated insult. It was designed to freeze my guests and humiliate my fiancé by shoving the landscaper and his wife out into the dirt where they belonged. The greenhouse, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. It is a conservatory, Vanessa corrected, examining her cuticles. It fits Julian's whole outdoor vibe. You can put some hay bales in the corner. Very chic. Very salt of the earth. My mother nodded in agreement, leaning forward to deliver the final blow. And since you insist on marrying this man, against my advice, I will not be contributing to your catering fund. I cannot, in good conscience, finance a mistake. You will have to pay for the food yourselves. We will attend as guests, but we will not sponsor your social suicide. The squeeze was on. They were attempting to force me into a corner. They believed the financial pressure and the social embarrassment would break my resolve. They wanted me to cancel the wedding crawl back to their pristine kitchen and beg them to find me a respectable match. They assumed they controlled the board because they held the social capital. But an auditor knows that a squeeze is often a desperate measure used by failing entities to hide their own insolvency. The conservatory will be fine, I said. I picked up the check for the table, paid the waiter in cash, and walked away from the patio without looking back. I did not break. I went to work. And the very next morning, a digital file landed on my desk that would hand me the keys to their destruction. My accounting firm was conducting a routine commercial risk assessment for a regional hospital group seeking a construction loan. I opened the ledger, poured a cup of black coffee, and began to scan the applicant data. Sitting right at the top of the pile was the detailed financial profile of the hospital's rising star, Dr. Pierce. Sitting in my glass office with the glow of the computer monitor illuminating my face, I stared at the digital file containing Dr. Pierce's financial profile. I felt no guilt about opening it. In my profession, you learn that empathy is a liability when dealing with predators. To understand my profound lack of remorse in that moment, you have to realize how my family's cruelty had evolved. It was no longer a collection of isolated insults. It had become a systemic routine, a coordinated sport they played to elevate their own standing. During the weeks following our initial engagement dinner, the hostility transformed into a polished, calculated campaign. Aunt Beatrice organized a Sunday brunch at her exclusive country club, ostensibly to discuss floral arrangements. The dining patio overlooked a manicured golf course, and the autumn air smelled of roasted espresso and damp pine needles. Vanessa arrived wearing a designer trench coat, flanked by Pierce, who sported a cashmere sweater draped casually over his shoulders. They steered every conversation toward status, ensuring Julian and I felt the full weight of our supposed inferiority. When the waiters brought out silver trays of dessert, Pierce leaned back in his wrought iron chair. He swirled a snifter of aged scotch, letting the amber liquid catch the afternoon sun. He locked eyes with Julian, a patronizing smirk curving his lips. "You know," Julian Pierce said, raising his voice just enough to ensure the neighboring tables could hear. "I was speaking with the Human Resources Director at my hospital this morning. They are actively looking for a new head groundskeeper. The current guy is retiring. I could put in a good word for you. It comes with dental benefits. We could get you out of the mud and into a steady paycheck." Vanessa covered her mouth, stifling a manufactured giggle. Aunt Beatrice took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, her eyes dancing with amusement. They waited for Julian to shrink. They wanted him to flush with embarrassment, to lower his head, or perhaps to lose his temper and prove he was the unrefined brute they believed him to be. Julian did none of those things. He placed his dessert spoon neatly on the edge of his porcelain plate. His composure was terrifying. It was the unnatural stillness of a predator watching a very small, very loud animal trap itself. "I appreciate the offer," Pierce Julian said. His voice carried a smooth, level cadence that required no volume to command the table. "I will be sure to look into your hospital's grounds." The family smirked, entirely missing the subtext. They took his polite response as submission. They consumed the red herring whole, patting themselves on the back for putting the blue-collar laborer in his place. They had no idea that Julian was not talking about planting tulips. He was talking about evaluating the hospital's exterior assets for corporate acquisition. He was examining the very ground Pierce walked on, calculating its market value, and recognizing that Pierce was nothing more than a tenant in a world Julian already owned. My mother, however, was mortified. She perceived Julian's calm acceptance as an admission of defeat. Sylvia reached under the table and grabbed my forearm. Her manicured nails dug sharply into my skin through the sleeve of my blouse. She yanked me toward her, her perfume smelling overwhelmingly of synthetic lilies and sharp alcohol. She leaned in, her teeth gritted into a rigid smile for the benefit of the surrounding club members. "You are embarrassing us," she hissed in my ear. "Look at him, accepting a handout from a real man. And look at you." Her gaze dropped to the center of my chest. I was wearing the dull brass safety deposit key on a silver chain. It rested right above my collarbone. It was the key Abuela Carmen had given me before her heart failed, the only authentic piece of legacy in a family drowning in manufactured prestige. "Take that cheap brass key off right now," Sylvia demanded, her grip tightening on my arm. "It ruins the aesthetic. You look like a custodian. Beatrice is hosting the bridal shower next month, and I will not allow you to wear garbage around your neck in front of her friends." I looked at my mother. I saw the deep, unhealed wounds of her own insecurity. The key bothered her because it was unpolished. It represented the cramped duplex in Dorchester. It represented Abuela Carmen coming home with hands blistered from industrial floor wax. Sylvia had spent her entire adult life running from that reality, burying her working-class roots under credit card debt and designer labels. My brass key was a ghost she could not banish. I pulled my arm out of her grasp. I adjusted the chain, ensuring the key rested prominently against my blouse. I refused to take it off. That brass key was a pebble that would soon trigger an avalanche. But in that moment on the country club patio, I chose silence. I let them feel superior. I let them exchange their knowing glances and sip their expensive scotch. I let them believe Julian was destitute and I was a pathetic failure who dragged down their pristine lineage. In forensic accounting, you learn a golden rule. You never interrupt a fraudster while they are incriminating themselves. You let them boast. You let them spend capital they do not possess. You wait until their signature is dry on the bottom line before you initiate the audit. That philosophy brought me back to my current reality, sitting in my quiet, temperature-controlled office, staring at the digital ledger of Dr. Pierce. The Sunday brunch insults echoed in my mind as I scrolled through his asset declarations, his tax filings, and his bank statements. My firm had been hired to evaluate the hospital's risk in extending a partnership to Pierce's private surgical group. It was a standard legal procedure. But what I found hidden in the fine print was anything but standard. I highlighted a recurring outbound wire transfer. I cross-referenced it with his stated income. The math fractured immediately. The prestigious neurosurgeon, the man who had just offered my fiancé a groundskeeping job out of pure spite, was harboring a financial secret so devastating it would soon collapse my aunt's entire estate. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing a line of red ink that connected Pierce's private accounts to a blind trust I recognized all too well. The real warfare was about to begin. The memory of the country club brunch faded into the crisp autumn air, but the hostility it birthed only sharpened as my wedding date drew near. Aunt Beatrice controlled the social calendar of our family with the precision of a military general. More importantly, she held the prestigious memberships required to secure the venues we were expected to use. As the weeks dwindled, she escalated her tactics. The sabotage moved from subtle remarks over tea to overt logistical warfare. Beatrice summoned me to her Wellesley estate on a chilly Tuesday evening. I arrived just after dusk. The wind carried a bitter edge rustling the bare branches of the oak trees lining the circular driveway. I found my aunt, my mother, and Vanessa standing on the expansive bluestone terrace behind the main house. Beatrice wore a tailored cashmere wrap against the cold. Sylvia held a silver pen and a leather-bound ledger. Vanessa lounged on a teak sofa, her face illuminated by the glow of her smartphone screen. They did not offer me a seat. Beatrice stepped forward, her posture rigid and triumphant. "I have finalized the event schedules with the club director," Beatrice announced, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet yard. "Vanessa will be getting the grand ballroom for her reception. It is the only space large enough to accommodate the surgeon's colleagues and our extended network. The crystal chandeliers will photograph beautifully for the society pages." Beatrice paused, letting the grandeur of Vanessa's arrangement settle over the terrace. Then she turned her gaze toward the far end of the property. She pointed a manicured finger toward the shadows. "Now regarding your arrangements, Liliana," Beatrice continued, feigning a tone of deep generosity. "The club is simply too formal for your particular situation. I have decided to host your reception here on my estate. You will use the detached glass conservatory." I followed her gaze to the structure looming in the dark. The conservatory was a relic from the previous property owner. It featured a wrought iron framework and single-pane glass. It had no central heating, no insulated flooring, and it smelled perpetually of damp potting soil and dormant ferns. It was essentially a glorified shed where the estate landscapers stored fertilizer during the winter months. Hosting a formal reception in an unheated greenhouse in late October was a calculated insult. It was a clear directive meant to freeze my guests and humiliate my fiancé. They were shoving the laborer and his wife out into the dirt where they belonged. "It fits Julian's rustic outdoor vibe," Vanessa chimed in. She did not bother to look up from her phone. "You can string up some bare light bulbs, serve barbecue, very salt of the earth." I turned to my mother, expecting at least a fraction of maternal defense. Instead, Sylvia clicked her silver pen shut. "Vanessa is right. My mother said, her expression entirely devoid of warmth. The setting is appropriate. Furthermore, since you insist on marrying this man against my direct advice, I am withdrawing my financial support. I will not pay a single cent toward your catering. I cannot, in good conscience, finance a mistake. You will figure out how to feed your guests on a gardener's budget." The strategy was obvious. In corporate rating, we call this the squeeze. You cut off the target's capital, isolate them from their resources, and degrade their operational environment until they surrender out of sheer desperation. My family designed this squeeze to break me. They wanted to force a cancellation out of pure embarrassment. They expected me to cry on the bluestone terrace, admit my defeat, and beg them to reinstate my funding. I looked at the three women standing in the cold. I felt the dull brass key resting warm against my collarbone beneath my coat. I did not break. I simply nodded. "The conservatory will be adequate," I said. I turned on my heel and walked back to my car, leaving them standing in the silent yard. When I returned to my apartment, Julian was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing a set of complex topographical blueprints. He looked up, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I poured 2 glasses of water and sat across from him. I laid out the terms of the evening. I explained the ballroom, the greenhouse, and the revoked catering budget. Julian listened without interrupting. He traced a contour line on his blueprint with the end of a pencil. When I finished, he did not exhibit a trace of anger. He merely smiled. "A greenhouse requires good soil to thrive," Julian said softly. "Let them have their ballroom. We will manage the cold." He knew something I did not, but he played his hand close to the chest. He absorbed their insults with the patience of a man who held the master deed to the entire board. I channeled the pressure of the impending wedding into the only sanctuary I trusted. I buried myself in my work. The glass walls of my downtown office became my fortress. I spent my days analyzing spreadsheets, verifying tax codes, and tracing the hidden movements of capital. The deeper I dug into the numbers, the less the wedding logistics mattered. This relentless focus brought me right back to the digital file I had opened the morning after that fateful Sunday brunch. My accounting firm was in the middle of assessing an 8-figure commercial loan application. The regional hospital group wanted to build a state-of-the-art neurological wing. To secure the funding, they listed their premier surgical talent as the primary guarantors. Sitting right at the top of the risk assessment file was the detailed financial profile of Dr. Pierce's private medical group. I pulled up his ledgers on my dual monitors. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, steady rhythm. In the quiet isolation of my office, I began to peel back the polished layers of the man my family worshipped. Vanessa believed she was marrying into untouchable prestige. Beatrice and Sylvia treated Pierce like a conquering king. But numbers do not care about a designer wardrobe or a country club handicap. Numbers only tell the truth. I cross-referenced his stated surgical income against his operational liabilities. The discrepancy was glaring. Pierce was not just struggling, he was drowning in a sea of red ink. I pulled his insurance filings. A series of undisclosed malpractice settlements had triggered astronomical premium hikes. The costs were garnishing his wages at an unsustainable rate. He was bringing in a fraction of his reported revenue, yet he was bleeding cash to maintain the illusion of high society wealth. He leased the luxury cars. He rented the designer watches. I scrolled further down the ledger, my eyes scanning the outbound wire transfers. The structural rot went deeper than bad spending habits. Pierce was bridging the gap between his failing practice and his lifestyle through a network of desperate, high-interest personal loans. He was entirely insolvent. He was not marrying my cousin out of profound devotion. Pierce was marrying Vanessa because he believed Aunt Beatrice possessed the immense wealth necessary to bail him out. He viewed the Wellesley estate and the country club pedigree as his financial salvation. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, the glow of the screens reflecting in my eyes. The irony was suffocating. My mother and my aunt were actively starving my wedding budget to punish me for marrying a man they deemed poor. Meanwhile, they were eagerly tying their golden child to a surgeon who was weeks away from total financial ruin. I saved the files to an encrypted internal server. I did not print the documents. I did not call my mother to gloat. I kept the secret locked behind my teeth. The venue downgrade was a petty, superficial wound. The ledger on my screen was a fatal blow. The real audit was only just beginning. Let me be clear about the nature of my discovery. I did not seek out Dr. Pierce's financial ruin out of petty spite. Forensic accountants do not risk their state licenses or their professional reputations to settle family grievances. The information came to me through standard, rigorous channels. The regional hospital group hired my downtown firm to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment for a proposed commercial expansion. They wanted a 9-figure construction loan to build a state-of-the-art neurological wing. To secure that level of funding from institutional lenders, the hospital board offered their top-earning surgical partners as collateral guarantors. Dr. Pierce signed a legal disclosure agreement authorizing a full financial sweep of his personal and corporate assets. He handed me the knife. I merely examined the blade. Sitting in the silent hum of my office, surrounded by glass walls that overlooked the gray Boston skyline, I opened his digital ledger. I poured a cup of black coffee and began to scroll through the incoming revenue columns. On the surface, his gross income looked impressive. It was the kind of number that justified country club memberships and imported sports cars. But in my profession, gross revenue is a vanity metric. It tells you what a person touches, not what they keep. I clicked over to the disbursement tabs and began to track the outbound capital. That is where the math stopped adding up. A recurring, staggering deduction caught my eye. It was categorized under professional liability overhead. I cross-referenced the routing numbers through the state insurance database. Pierce was not paying standard malpractice premiums. He was funding a punitive tier policy. A series of sealed, out-of-court settlements had triggered a severe restructuring of his clinical coverage. The insurance consortium was garnishing 80% of his surgical wages before the money ever touched his personal checking account. The man who had smugly offered my fiancé a job planting shrubs was standing in an operating room for 12 hours a day performing complex spinal fusions and walking away with a fraction of his worth. He was a high-functioning, indentured servant to his own medical mistakes. That explained the cash flow deficit. It did not explain how he maintained his pristine, high society illusion. How does a man losing 4/5 of his paycheck afford a penthouse in the Back Bay? How does he buy vintage Rolex watches and a 10-carat diamond engagement ring for my cousin? You look at the liabilities column. I pulled his real property records from the county municipal registry. The Back Bay penthouse, a property located on a cobblestone street lined with gas lamps, was heavily leveraged. He had taken out a second and third mortgage against the equity. Sitting quietly at the bottom of the public record was a notice of default. His primary residence was in pre-foreclosure. He was 30 days away from the bank changing the locks on his front door. He wore cashmere sweaters to Sunday brunch while sleeping in an apartment that technically belonged to a debt collection agency. He was entirely insolvent. But a man facing foreclosure still needs liquid cash to keep up appearances. I traced the origin of his recent capital influx. A series of short-term, high-yield personal loans bridged his checking accounts over the last 6 months. The interest rates were predatory. They were the kind of desperate terms you accept only when traditional lenders lock you out and your credit score collapses. I followed the routing numbers backwards. I peeled away the corporate LLC shells designed to obscure the identity of the lender. The digital trail led to a regional wealth management firm. I typed in the specific routing identification number. The screen populated with the registrant data. The lender was not a faceless corporate entity or a shadow bank. It was a private blind trust. The primary trustee listed on the account was Beatrice, my Aunt Beatrice. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The ergonomic mesh of my chair creaked in the silent office as I leaned forward. The reality of the transaction settled over me with a cold, terrifying clarity. Dr. Pierce, the elite neurosurgeon, the crown jewel of our family's social ambition, was borrowing predatory capital from his future mother-in-law just to keep his own lights on. The irony was practically Shakespearean. Vanessa and Pierce were engaged in a mutual con. Each believed the other held the winning lottery ticket. Pierce was marrying my cousin to secure permanent access to Beatrice's presumed wealth. He viewed the sprawling Wellesley estate as his financial lifeboat. Vanessa was marrying Pierce to secure her position in the elite medical echelon, believing his surgical prestige would elevate her far above our working-class Dorchester roots. Neither of them knew the truth. Pierce was broke, and based on the desperate nature of the loans Beatrice was issuing, she was hemorrhaging cash to keep the charade afloat. She was bleeding herself dry to fund a son-in-law who was simultaneously draining her accounts. It was a closed loop of financial ruin. They were all standing on the deck of a sinking ship, arguing over who had the better view of the ocean. I looked at the red ink glowing on the dual monitors. A lesser person might have printed the ledgers, driven straight to the country club patio, and slammed the documents down on the wrought iron table. I could have ended Vanessa's wedding right then. I could have exposed the arrogant surgeon and watched Aunt Beatrice crumble under the weight of her own fraudulent posturing. It would have been easy to dial my mother's number and listen to her pristine world shatter over the phone. But you never interrupt a failing entity while they are busy miscalculating their own leverage. If I exposed them now, they would scramble. They would find a way to spin the narrative. They would hire crisis managers, blame the hospital administration, or claim the public records were a temporary liquidity issue caused by a bad investment. They needed to feel secure. They needed to walk all the way to the edge of the cliff under their own power, believing they controlled the terrain. I closed the digital files. I logged out of the encrypted server and wiped my access history from the active terminal. I boxed up the physical paperwork the client had provided and locked it securely inside my filing cabinet. I did not call my mother. I did not text Vanessa. I kept my mouth shut. I poured the rest of my cold coffee down the sink and packed my leather briefcase. The Pierce revelation was merely half of the equation. I knew the surgeon was insolvent, and I knew he was draining my aunt. But I needed to know the exact structural integrity of Beatrice's estate. The trust account that funded Pierce was linked directly to the Wellesley property, where my mother and aunt had orchestrated their campaign of cruelty against my fiancé. I reached up and touched my collarbone. The dull metal of Abuela Carmen's safety deposit key rested warm against my skin beneath my blouse. Sylvia had called it garbage. She had demanded I hide it to preserve her pristine aesthetic. She had no idea that the piece of brass she despised was the very instrument required to unlock the truth about the ground she stood on. The time for waiting in the shadows was over. It was time to visit the bank. I drafted a short email to my managing partner requesting 4 hours of personal leave. I shut down my computer, grabbed my wool trench coat, and took the elevator down to the street level. The Boston air was sharp, carrying the bitter chill of late autumn. I walked briskly away from the towering glass structures of the financial district, heading toward a historic banking institution situated on a narrow cobblestone corner near Post Office Square. For the past 6 months, my mother had treated the dull piece of hardware resting against my collarbone as an aesthetic tragedy. She believed it belonged to a forgotten locker or a rusted toolbox. She lacked the imagination to realize Abuela Carmen did not hoard useless metal. My grandmother was a woman who scrubbed commercial floors until her joints ached. She understood the value of $1 better than the daughters who squandered her legacy on country club dues and imported silk. I stepped through the heavy revolving doors of the bank. The interior smelled of polished mahogany and old currency. I approached the subterranean vault desk and handed my identification to the attendant. I unclasped the silver chain from my neck and placed the brass key on the counter. The attendant verified my signature, picked up his own master key, and escorted me into the temperature-controlled vault. The steel walls echoed with our footsteps. We located the corresponding safe deposit box. He inserted his key, I inserted mine, and the dual tumblers clicked in unison. He pulled the long metal drawer from the wall, set it on a rolling cart, and directed me toward a private viewing room. The door shut softly behind me, sealing me in a windowless space illuminated by a single fluorescent overhead fixture. I sat at the small wooden table and pulled the metal container toward my chest. I did not know what I would find. Part of me expected family heirlooms, perhaps a collection of vintage jewelry my mother and Aunt Beatrice had failed to pawn, perhaps a stack of faded photographs from the Dorchester duplex. I opened the hinged lid. The box was empty except for a thick, unmarked manila envelope resting flat on the bottom. I untied the string closure and slid the contents onto the table. There were no jewels. There was only heavy, watermarked bond paper. I unfolded the top document, my eyes scanning the legal header. It was a property deed. Specifically, it was the original deed of ownership for the sprawling Wellesley estate. My breath caught in my throat. I read the grantor and grantee sections twice to ensure I was interpreting the legal jargon correctly. Aunt Beatrice had always paraded the estate as her personal domain. She hosted garden parties on the bluestone terrace and treated the grounds like a kingdom she had earned by marrying well. but her name was not listed as the owner. Abuela Carmen had purchased the property decades ago through a series of quiet, shrewd real estate investments. But she knew her daughters. She knew their insatiable hunger for status would cause them to liquidate any asset they could reach to fund their superficial lifestyles. So before her heart failed, Abuela did not bequeath the estate to Beatriz. She placed the deed into an irrevocable, blind trust. Beatriz was permitted to reside in the home, but she possessed zero equity in the actual property. She was effectively a glorified tenant. That revelation alone was staggering. But the true horror of my aunt's situation was buried in the stack of papers beneath the deed. I picked up a bundle of documents printed on banking letterhead. They were recent correspondence addressed to the trust administrator. I laid them out side by side on the table. My forensic training took over piecing together the timeline of a spectacular financial crime. Over the past 2 years, Aunt Beatriz had grown desperate. Her late husband's life insurance had dried up, yet she refused to curtail her spending. To keep up appearances, she needed liquid capital. Without consulting the trust, Beatriz had fraudulently presented herself as the sole property owner to a series of secondary lending institutions. She forged authorization documents. She leveraged the Wellesley estate as collateral to secure 3 separate, substantial lines of credit. I checked the dates of the loan distributions. The first influx of cash coincided perfectly with Vanessa's lavish engagement party. The second matched a string of high-yield predatory loans funneled directly to Dr. Pierce to keep his failing medical practice afloat. The third loan was a desperate attempt to cover the interest payments on the first 2. Beatriz had built a house of cards on a foundation she did not even own. She had committed textbook fiduciary fraud. And the consequences of her hubris were printed in stark black and white on the final page of the stack. It was a formal notice of default. The secondary lenders had realized they were dealing with toxic debt. Beatriz had missed 6 consecutive mortgage payments. The grace period had evaporated. The bank had initiated formal collection protocols. Attached to the default warning was a final notice of intent to foreclose. The Wellesley estate, the very property where my aunt planned to host my unheated, humiliating wedding reception, was quietly slipping into commercial foreclosure. The property was scheduled to hit the private auction block in a matter of weeks. I sat back in the stiff wooden chair. The silence of the viewing room amplified the thumping of my own pulse. I pictured my mother and my aunt standing on the patio just a few nights prior, wrapped in cashmere, dictating how I would feed my guests on a gardener's budget. I pictured Vanessa lounging on the teak sofa, mocking my fiancé, secure in her belief that she was ascending to the pinnacle of Boston society. They were acting like royalty while standing on a trap door. They treated Julian like dirt, entirely unaware that their own pristine world was built on forged signatures and predatory debt. They had no money. They had no home. They had nothing but a curated illusion that was hours away from shattering. A strange sensation washed over me. It was not pity. It was not fear. It was a cold, crystalline clarity. Every insult they had hurled at me over the past 6 months lost its weight. Their condescension was just the desperate flailing of cornered animals. I gathered the heavy bond papers. I stacked the default notices, the forged loan authorizations, and the original property deed. I slid them carefully back into the thick manila envelope and tied the string closure tight. I placed the envelope into the metal box, shut the lid, and signaled for the vault attendant. My hands were shaking as I walked out of the historic bank and back onto the cobblestone streets of Boston. The tremor in my fingers had nothing to do with anxiety. It was the adrenaline of an auditor who had just found the smoking gun. I held the keys to their destruction. I could end their social reign with a single phone call to the authorities. I could ensure my aunt faced criminal charges for her fraudulent leverage. But releasing the information now would be premature. The wedding was approaching. To exact a toll equal to the pain they had inflicted upon me, the revelation needed an audience. It required the very society they worshipped to witness their fall. I hailed a taxi. I did not go back to my glass office. I gave the driver an address on the outskirts of the city. I needed to see Julian. I needed to look my fiancé in the eye and tell him that the Wellesley estate was plunging into foreclosure. I wanted to warn him about the storm that was about to consume my family. But as the taxi pulled away from the curb, I had no idea that my humble, calloused fiancé was harboring a secret of his own. I thought I was driving to a muddy construction trailer to share my discovery. I was entirely unprepared for the towering glass skyscraper that awaited me and the phone call I was about to overhear. The taxi navigated the congested streets, moving away from the historic financial center and toward the sleek, modernized Seaport district. I leaned my head against the cold window glass, watching the gray waters of the harbor slide past. My pulse maintained a steady, rapid rhythm. Inside my leather briefcase, I carried the mental blueprint of my aunt's ruined finances. I intended to deliver this blueprint to my fiancé. I wanted to warn Julian about the impending collapse of the Wellesley estate before my family tried to drag us down into their crater. Julian had given me his office address months ago. He wrote it on the back of a receipt during one of our early dates. I had never visited him during work hours. My demanding audit schedule kept me confined to my own desk, and he spent most of his days out in the field. Or so I believed. I expected the taxi to pull into an industrial park. I anticipated gravel crunching under tires, chain-link fences, and a modular construction trailer smelling of diesel fuel and wet earth. The driver pulled over to the curb and shifted the car into park. I looked out the window and frowned. We were idling outside a towering 60-story skyscraper composed of intersecting geometric glass panels. The building reflected the bruised autumn sky. There was no dirt. There was no heavy machinery. There was only polished steel and elite corporate architecture. I checked the address on my phone. The numbers matched perfectly. I paid the fare, stepped out onto the pristine sidewalk, and walked through the automated revolving doors. The lobby was a cavernous expanse of imported Italian granite and brushed bronze. Men in tailored wool suits and women carrying designer briefcases moved with frantic purpose. I approached the sleek security desk located in the center of the atrium. Behind the desk, a sprawling digital directory listed the corporate tenants. I scanned the illuminated names, searching for Vanguard Ecological. I found it listed on the 58th floor, but my eyes caught the bold text directly above it. The 59th and 60th floors belonged to a single entity, Mercer Holdings. Julian's last name was Mercer. I told myself it was a coincidence. Mercer is a common surname. Julian was a site manager. My mother had verified his blue-collar status by staring at his scuffed boots and judging his unbranded shirts. I approached the security guard, presented my identification, and stated I was here to see Julian Mercer at Vanguard Ecological. The guard typed my name into his terminal. His posture shifted immediately. He straightened his spine and offered a polite, deferential nod. Yes, Miss Perez. Mr. Mercer is in a board meeting, but he left instructions to allow you up whenever you arrived. Please use the private executive elevator on the far right. It will take you directly to the penthouse suite. I did not correct him. I did not mention the 58th floor. I walked to the designated elevator, swiped the temporary access card the guard provided, and pressed the single illuminated button. The car ascended with a silent, stomach-dropping velocity. My forensic accounting brain began to process the environmental data. You do not secure a dedicated express elevator in a seaport high-rise on a site manager salary. You do not occupy the penthouse suite of a premier commercial property unless you hold the lease for the entire building. The elevator doors slid open. I stepped onto thick, sound-absorbing carpet. The reception area was immaculate, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Boston Harbor. A minimalist reception desk sat empty. The air smelled of expensive cedar and ozone. I walked down the wide corridor. The walls were constructed of transparent acoustic glass. Toward the end of the hall, I saw the main conference room. The door was left slightly ajar. I paused in the shadows of the corridor, keeping out of direct sight, and listened. I recognized the voice instantly. It was Julian. But the tone was different. It lacked the gentle, patient cadence he used when dealing with my family. This voice was authoritative. It was the sharp, decisive sound of a man who controlled the room and everyone in it. "I need the risk profiles on the residential defaults by Tuesday morning," Julian said. "We are not interested in restructuring the toxic loans. The regional bank overextended their leverage, and we are buying the paper at 40 cents on the dollar. Liquidate the non-performing assets. Mercer Holdings will absorb the prime real estate and fold the commercial properties into our Vanguard subsidiary for ecological redevelopment." A second voice spoke. It sounded like a seasoned Wall Street broker. "The acquisition is finalized, Julian. We are prepared to wire the escrow funds. Taking on this much distressed debt gives you unprecedented leverage over the local zoning boards. You effectively own the waterfront development rights." I leaned against the cool glass wall in the corridor. The reality of the situation washed over me in a profound, undeniable wave. I closed my eyes and let the math assemble itself in my mind. Vanguard Ecological was not his employer. It was a subsidiary shell. Julian was the founder and chief executive officer of Mercer Holdings. He was a titan of commercial real estate. He was a man who casually authorized multi-million-dollar acquisitions of bad debt portfolios on a Tuesday afternoon. He wore scuffed boots because he preferred the authenticity of the soil to the sterile environment of a boardroom. He planted deep structural roots while the men in tailored suits scurried to execute his commands. I shifted my weight and peered through the narrow gap in the doorway. Julian stood at the head of a massive, live-edge wooden conference table. He wore his standard denim button-down with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing his tanned forearms. 5 men in pristine luxury suits sat around the table, furiously taking notes on their tablets. Julian dominated the space effortlessly. The irony was staggering. My mother and Aunt Beatrice spent their days desperate to rub shoulders with local wealth. They groveled for country club invitations and worshipped a neurosurgeon drowning in malpractice debt. They treated my fiancé like a peasant. They relegated him to an unheated greenhouse and mocked his unbranded clothing. They had no idea they were throwing insults at a billionaire who could purchase their entire social network with the stroke of a pen. More importantly, I realized the specific nature of the business transaction Julian was authorizing. He was buying up distressed residential debt from regional banks. My aunt had just defaulted on a massive, fraudulent loan tied to her Wellesley estate. The trap was setting itself with poetic precision. I stepped back from the door. I did not interrupt his meeting. I did not burst into the boardroom to demand answers about his hidden wealth. True power does not require an immediate announcement. True power waits for the perfect moment to reveal its hand. Julian looked up from the table. His gaze shifted through the glass walls and locked onto mine. He paused his presentation. The fierce, commanding executive vanished, and the warm, familiar smile of the man I loved returned to his face. He offered a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. I smiled back. I turned around and walked back toward the private elevator. I did not need to warn him about my aunt and her impending foreclosure. I did not need to protect him from the condescension of my family. Julian was the apex predator of their financial ecosystem. The dynamic of the upcoming wedding shifted entirely in my mind. I was no longer an embattled daughter trying to survive a hostile reception. I was an auditor, walking into a room full of insolvent frauds alongside the man who owned their debt. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for the following evening. My family planned to use the event to launch their final, coordinated psychological assault before the wedding ceremony. They intended to crush us under the weight of their fabricated prestige. But as the elevator descended back to the street level, I felt an incredible sense of calm. The audience now knew the truth. I knew the truth. My family remained blissfully ignorant. The stage was set for a spectacular collision, and the rehearsal dinner would serve as the ultimate pressure cooker. The 24 hours following my discovery at the Seaport District blurred into a sharp, focused waiting game. The knowledge of Julian's true identity sat quietly in my chest, a loaded weapon I carried into the final evening before the wedding. We hosted the rehearsal dinner at an intimate, exposed brick bistro in the South End. Julian and I covered the entire bill, reserving a private back room illuminated by flickering Edison bulbs. The atmosphere was supposed to be celebratory. Instead, the friction in the space felt thick enough to suffocate a person. My mother sat near the head of the long oak table, radiating a cold hostility. She picked up her crystal wine glass, holding it by the stem, and lifted it toward the amber light. She swirled the dark liquid, her lips pressed into a thin white line. "It lacks finish," Sylvia stated, projecting her voice to ensure the passing sommelier caught the critique. "When Beatrice hosted the country club mixer last spring, we poured a vintage Bordeaux. This tastes like a table blend." She set the glass down with a sharp clink. Growing up in a cramped duplex, Sylvia had learned to mask her insecurities by preemptively rejecting anything she deemed unworthy. She weaponized her discontent to assert dominance. Paying for her own meal was beneath her, but criticizing a free one was her specialty. She wanted everyone in the room to understand that our chosen venue was a severe disappointment compared to the opulent standards she believed she deserved. Aunt Beatrice sat directly across from me, nodding in solidarity with my mother's complaint. Beatrice wore a heavy silk blouse, projecting the image of a seasoned matriarch holding court. She steered the conversation away from our upcoming nuptials and seamlessly hijacked the spotlight for her own daughter. "Wait until you see the floral arrangements we secured for the grand ballroom," Beatrice projected, slicing into her braised duck with a silver knife. "We are flying in white orchids from a private greenhouse in Holland. The club director told me it will be the event of the season. Vanessa simply requires a venue that matches her caliber." I watched my aunt dab the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. The dramatic irony tasted far richer than the food on my plate. I knew her bank accounts were frozen. I knew the Wellesley estate was plunging headfirst toward a public auction due to her fraudulent maneuvers. Beatrice was boasting about imported Dutch orchids while sitting on a fragile mountain of defaulted loans. The sheer audacity of her delusion required a profound level of cognitive dissonance. She was spending imaginary capital to humiliate me, oblivious to the reality that the man sitting quietly beside me had likely purchased the very debt that would render her homeless. Vanessa leaned into the conversation, adjusting the neckline of her designer dress. "It is just a matter of setting the right tone," she added, glancing sideways at my simple attire. "A wedding dictates the trajectory of a marriage. You start small, you stay small." The hostility escalated further when the waiters cleared the dinner plates and brought out the espresso. Dr. Pierce had spent the evening consuming a significant amount of the wine my mother claimed to despise. His face held a flush of manufactured confidence. He draped one arm over the back of Vanessa's chair, adjusting his rented Rolex so the watch face caught the overhead lighting. He reached for a silver spoon and tapped it rhythmically against his water glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low hum of restaurant chatter. The table fell silent. Pierce stood up, swaying just a fraction of an inch, and offered a magnanimous, condescending grin. "I want to propose a quick toast," Pierce declared, looking down his nose at Julian. "I actually made a few phone calls this afternoon. I spoke directly with the Human Resources Department at my surgical center. I pulled a few strings." Pierce paused, soaking in the rapt attention of my mother and aunt. He savored the perceived power dynamic, treating his next words like a royal decree. "The groundskeeper position is yours if you want it, Julian. I secured the interview for Monday morning. You just need to show up and pass the background check." "I am just trying to make sure Liliana does not have to spend her first year of marriage living in a trailer." The cruelty hung in the air heavy and unvarnished. Vanessa let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed off the brick walls. Sylvia offered a polite, approving nod, thrilled to see the blue-collar laborer put in his proper place. Beatrice raised her espresso cup in silent agreement. They were actively rejoicing in our presumed poverty. They believed Pierce was dispensing charity to a beggar, cementing their own status at the top of the familial hierarchy. The heat rushed to my face. My vision tunneled, narrowing, until all I could see was the smug, intoxicated surgeon standing at the end of the table. I felt the sharp edges of the brass key resting against my collarbone beneath my shirt. I knew his secrets. I knew Pierce was drowning in malpractice garnishments and predatory debt. I knew his luxury condo was in pre-foreclosure. The urge to dismantle his entire existence right then and there overwhelmed my senses. I opened my mouth, ready to scream the truth across the table. I wanted to open the verbal ledger, list his defaulted loans, and watch his arrogant smile disintegrate into pure terror. I wanted to tell Beatrice her house belonged to my fiancé. I wanted to strip them of their illusions and leave them exposed in the harsh light of their own financial ruin. Before a single syllable could escape my lips, a warm, heavy weight pressed onto my leg under the table. Julian shifted his posture. His large, calloused hand gripped my knee with a firm, grounding pressure. The heat of his palm anchored me to the present moment, pulling me back from the edge of my fury. He leaned toward me, his shoulder brushing against mine. The scent of rain and cedar cut through the stale restaurant air. His eyes remained locked on Pierce, his expression a mask of terrifying tranquility. "Do not," Julian whispered, his voice a low, steady vibration that only I could hear. I looked at his profile. The founder of Mercer Holdings was sitting in a dimly lit bistro, absorbing the insults of a bankrupt fraud, without a trace of wounded ego. Julian understood the mechanics of power better than anyone in the room. He knew that a premature execution only allowed the target time to mitigate the damage. You do not strike when the enemy expects a fight. You strike when they believe they have already won. Never interrupt an enemy who is busy destroying themselves. Julian continued, his grip tightening for a brief, reassuring second. Let them dig their own graves tonight. Tomorrow, we bury them. I closed my mouth. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, measured sip. The anger receded, replaced by a cold, calculating anticipation. I let Pierce finish his toast. I watched my mother pack up her designer coat, complaining about the damp weather outside. The rehearsal dinner ended with my family convinced of their supreme victory. They returned to their respective homes, dreaming of imported orchids and elite status, entirely unaware that the dawn would bring a reckoning they could not escape. The trap was locked. The debt was due. All that remained was the morning of the wedding and the missing gown that would ignite the final sequence of their destruction. The sun rose over Boston the next morning, casting a pale, cold light across the harbor and illuminating the final day of my family's illusion. That dawn brought me right back to the exact moment we started this story. I stood inside the country club bridal suite, holding a cardboard tray of coffees, staring at my cousin. Vanessa remained elevated on the velvet pedestal, admiring her own reflection while draped in my custom silk gown. My mother, Sylvia, pressed the cheap plastic garment bag against my chest, commanding me to wear the clearance rack polyester. She expected tears. She wanted me to shatter. She needed me to validate her belief that my life was a profound failure because I chose a man who worked with his hands over a neurosurgeon drowning in unacknowledged debt. I looked at my mother. I heard Julian's voice echoing in my mind from the rehearsal dinner the night prior, telling me to let them dig their graves. Put on the polyester, Liliana Sylvia commanded, her tone sharp and impatient, echoing off the mirrored walls. We are on a strict schedule. Do not make a scene. Be grateful you have anything to wear at all. I looked at the red clearance sticker dangling from the zipper of the synthetic fabric. I looked at Vanessa, who refused to meet my eyes, opting instead to adjust the delicate beadwork of my stolen dress. I did not argue. I did not demand they take it off or threaten to cancel the event. The time for negotiating with frauds had expired. I offered my mother a slow, unbothered smile. Keep it, I said. My voice betrayed zero emotion, cold and level. You both need the fabric far more than I do. I turned on my heel, leaving the coffee tray on a side table, and walked out the heavy mahogany doors. Behind me, I heard the faint rustle of confusion. They had prepared a script for a hysterical bride. They had rehearsed their patronizing comfort. They had no defense against a woman walking away in total, suffocating silence. I walked to my car, the crisp morning air clearing the scent of hairspray from my lungs. I slid behind the steering wheel and drove away from the manicured lawns of the country club, heading straight toward my apartment in Cambridge. My family thought they had cornered me. They believed stealing my dress was the final checkmate in their 6-month campaign of psychological warfare. They failed to realize they were playing checkers while I was auditing the entire board. When Abuela Carmen handed me that dull brass key days before she passed, she did not just leave me a safety deposit box containing the true deed to the Wellesley estate. She left me a second item, a physical asset she had fiercely guarded for decades, keeping it hidden from the vultures in her own bloodline. During the 1980s, Sylvia and Beatrice spent years tearing through Abuela's Dorchester duplex. They scoured the dusty attic and rummaged through the damp basement. They hunted for a legendary piece of family history they intended to pawn to fund their burgeoning country club aspirations. They wanted to trade their heritage for a down payment on a luxury sedan or a membership fee. They never found it. Abuela knew their greed would consume any legacy she left behind, so she hid it. She entrusted it to the only granddaughter who evaluated worth by structural integrity rather than a retail price tag. I unlocked the door to my apartment and walked straight to my bedroom closet. The space was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic vanity of the bridal suite. I pushed aside my tailored work suits and reached into the dark corner, pulling out a heavy, cedar-lined canvas garment bag. I laid it gently on the surface of my bed, smoothing the thick material with my palms. I gripped the brass zipper pull and drew it down the length of the canvas. The fabric parted, revealing a piece of old-world royalty that took my breath away. It was a pristine 1920s vintage haute couture gown. The dress was spun from pure ivory silk and overlaid with intricate hand-stitched Chantilly lace. It belonged to my great-grandmother, brought over from Europe before the wars, preserved with meticulous, loving care in a temperature-controlled vault until Abuela moved it to my closet. The silk held a soft, luminescent sheen that no modern boutique could replicate. It was museum quality. It was a masterpiece of textile engineering, holding decades of authentic history in every delicate thread. My mother and aunt would have sold it for a fraction of its worth, just to buy a new patio set. I stripped off my street clothes and stepped into the gown. I reached around to secure the row of tiny pearl buttons tracing my spine. As the heavy silk settled over my shoulders and cascaded down to the floor, the sensation was profound. It did not feel like a costume. It fit like armor. The cut was immaculate, wrapping around me with the tailored precision of a garment destined for this exact moment. I walked over to the full-length mirror in my bedroom. I pinned my dark hair back into a sleek, minimalist knot, refusing to distract from the high lace collar. I applied a subtle touch of dark red lipstick. I looked at the reflection of the forensic accountant who was about to dismantle her family's fraudulent empire. I did not look like a victim shoved into a clearance rack shift. I looked like the sole heir to a legacy my mother had forfeited out of pure vanity. I grabbed my leather clutch, ensuring the brass key and a printed copy of the Wellesley default notice were tucked safely inside. I walked out of my apartment, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the hardwood stairs. The drive to the historic chapel felt different than any commute I had ever taken. I watched the Boston skyline shift through the windshield, the towering glass structures giving way to the older stone facades of the city. My family was waiting at the venue right now, anticipating the arrival of a humiliated bride. They were eager to pity me. They were ready to whisper their condescending remarks from the wooden pews, while Vanessa sat in the front row, wearing my stolen custom silk. I pulled into the chapel parking lot. The Gothic stone architecture loomed against the autumn sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. I shifted the car into park and let the engine idle for a brief second. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, feeling the cool silk against my skin and the scent of antique cedar in the air. I did not need their approval. I did not need their money. I certainly did not need the dress they stole. I opened the car door and stepped onto the pavement, ready for war. The string quartet was likely tuning their instruments inside. The visual shockwave I was about to deliver walking down that aisle would serve as the opening argument of their audit. The true ledger of our family was about to be read aloud, and the entire room was going to hear the math fail. I stood in the dim stone vestibule of the historic chapel. The air felt heavy-scented with burning beeswax candles and polished wood. Beyond the thick oak double doors, the string quartet shifted from their prelude into the measured ascending notes of the processional. The cello resonated through the floorboards, vibrating against the soles of my shoes. I did not have bridesmaids flanking me. I did not have a father waiting to give me away. My relatives had ensured I stood in this antechamber alone, believing my isolation would break my spirit before I ever reached the altar. They were mistaken. Solitude is the natural habitat of an auditor preparing to balance a corrupted ledger. I handed my leather clutch containing the printed default notices and the brass safety deposit key to the wedding coordinator, with strict instructions to place it at my designated reception seat. I smoothed the front of my great-grandmother's ivory gown. The fabric moved like liquid mercury over my skin. The heavy iron latches clicked. The ushers pulled the oak doors outward, flooding the vestibule with warm golden light filtering down from the towering stained glass windows. I stepped over the threshold. The sanctuary was packed. To my right sat Julian's guests. They were a quiet, unassuming collection of project managers, site engineers, and childhood friends who understood the value of fierce loyalty. To my left sat the curated audience my mother and aunt had assembled. Society columnists, country club board members, and minor local politicians occupied the polished wooden benches. They turned their heads in unison, their faces arranged in expressions of practiced pity, fully expecting a tragic figure wrapped in a clearance rack shift to shuffle down the carpet. I began my walk. I kept my chin parallel to the floor, my pace deliberate and unhurried. The reaction from the left side of the pathway was instantaneous. It was a seismic rupture rippling through their carefully constructed decorum. About 3 rows back, Aunt Beatrice inhaled so sharply the sound carried over the soaring violin strings. Her hands went slack. The thick cardstock wedding program slipped through her fingers, fluttering down to the stone floor. She did not bend to retrieve it. Her wide eyes were fixed on the intricate Chantilly lace tracing my collarbone. Beside her sat my mother. Sylvia had spent 30 years cultivating an icy, impenetrable composure. In a matter of seconds, that composure fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen gray. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the back of the pew in front of her. She recognized the vintage garment immediately. It was the white whale of her youth, the legendary heirloom she had spent the entire 1980s tearing apart a Dorchester duplex to locate. She had wanted to sell my great-grandmother's history to fund a country club deposit. Now, that exact history was draped over the daughter she had tried to discard. The realization that Abuela Carmen had hidden the treasure specifically for me struck Sylvia like a physical blow. Then there was Vanessa. My cousin sat in the front row, occupying the seat of honor. She wore my stolen custom gown. Just 2 hours prior, she had posed in front of the bridal suite mirror, convinced she was the undisputed sovereign of the day. As I glided past her pew, the reality of the contrast settled over the room. My 1920s haute couture rendered her stolen garment tragically ordinary. Next to museum-quality silk and authentic hand-stitched European lace, Vanessa's modern dress looked like a synthetic imitation, a shiny costume purchased for a school play. A blotchy, furious flush crept up Vanessa's neck, settling deep into her cheeks. She crossed her arms, her manicured nails digging into the bodice of the stolen fabric, unable to mask her seething humiliation. Next to Vanessa, Dr. Pierce shifted uncomfortably. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, sensing the abrupt shift in the social hierarchy, but lacking the historical context to understand why his future mother-in-law looked as though she had seen a ghost. Whispers ignited among the society guests. The hushed murmurs spread like a localized fire through the left side of the chapel. The elite crowd my aunt had invited to witness my degradation were instead witnessing a coronation. They recognized authentic luxury. They were studying the flawless drape of the silk and the immaculate tailoring, recalculating my worth in real time. My mother had intended to stage a public execution of my dignity. Instead, she had inadvertently provided the premier audience for my ascension. I tuned out their frantic whispering and shifted my focus to the end of the aisle. Julian stood at the altar. He wore a crisp, impeccably tailored navy suit. His broad shoulders relaxed as our eyes met. He did not look surprised by the vintage gown, nor did he pay any attention to the gasps echoing from my family's side of the room. A subtle, knowing smile played at the corners of his mouth. He looked at me the way a man looks at an equal partner, seeing the structural steel beneath the silk. I reached the altar steps. Julian stepped forward and offered his hand. I placed my palm in his. His skin was rough, bearing the calluses of a man who spent his life building foundations from the ground up. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the soft, unblemished hands of the surgeon sitting in the front row. Julian leaned his head down, the faint scent of cedar washing over me. "You look like a queen," he murmured. His voice, a low vibration, meant only for us. "I feel like one," I replied, my eyes locked on his. The officiant began the ceremony. The traditional vows flowed through the cavernous chapel, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. For 20 minutes, the sacred rituals insulated us from the venom radiating from the front pews. But I could feel the hostile energy mounting just over my shoulder. My mother and aunt were trapped in their seats, forced to watch the daughter they despised command a room they believed they owned. Their social dominance had been fractured by a single piece of fabric. An auditor knows that a visual humiliation is merely the opening statement of the trial. The true reckoning requires ledgers, facts, and the cold, hard reality of consequence. The ceremony concluded with a kiss, the chapel erupted into applause, and we turned to walk back down the carpet as husband and wife. The prelude was over, the battle lines were drawn. The reception awaited us at the Wellesley estate, where Aunt Beatrice had prepared her freezing glass conservatory trap, entirely unaware that the man holding my hand was the incoming landlord. The drive from the historic chapel to the Wellesley estate took 30 minutes. The Massachusetts autumn had turned bitter by late afternoon. The sky bruised into shades of deep purple and charcoal, signaling an early frost. I sat in the passenger seat of Julian's truck, the heater running full blast, the vintage silk of my great-grandmother's gown pooling around my ankles. I watched the sprawling suburban mansions roll past the window. The visual shock of my dress had rendered my family speechless during the ceremony, but I knew their silence was only temporary. They were retreating to a fortified position, preparing to execute the next phase of their sabotage. We turned onto the long driveway of Aunt Beatrice's property. The tires crunched over fallen oak leaves and pristine gravel. I noticed the main house was dark, except for the exterior carriage lights illuminating the grand entryway. My friends from the accounting firm, along with Julian's site managers and engineers, were already parking their vehicles along the manicured hedges. They walked toward the front doors, pulling their wool coats tight against the biting wind. I stepped out of the truck. The cold hit my lungs like shattered glass. Julian placed a warm hand on my lower back, guiding me along the flagstone path to join our guests. We approached the heavy oak double doors of the estate. A small printed sign hung from the brass knocker. It directed all wedding attendees to proceed around the side of the property to the rear gardens. Through the front window, I saw my aunt standing in the foyer. She wore a smug smile, holding a glass of champagne. She pointed a manicured finger toward the backyard, silently mocking our arrival. She had locked us out. We followed the stone path around the brick mansion and saw our destination. The detached glass conservatory sat in the deep shadows of the estate. It was a skeletal structure constructed of rusted wrought iron and single-pane windows. The interior was lit by a few harsh industrial bulbs hanging from exposed wires. Our guests stood huddled inside, their breath visible in the freezing air. The floor was composed of loose gravel and packed dirt. The space smelled of decaying fern fronds, damp earth, and stale fertilizer. Adjacent to the greenhouse, elevated on a heated stone patio, stood Vanessa and my mother. Tall heat lamps radiated a comfortable orange glow over their shoulders. Vanessa leaned against the stone balustrade, swirling a hot toddy in a ceramic mug. She looked down at my shivering guests. Enjoy the rustic aesthetic, Liliana, Vanessa called out, her voice cutting through the sharp wind. It is so authentic. It really fits Julian's whole vibe. Do not worry about us up here. We will just watch. My mother stood beside her, wrapping a cashmere shawl tighter around her neck. Sylvia offered a satisfied, tight-lipped nod. She believed she had executed the perfect checkmate. She thought she had stripped us of our dignity by forcing my colleagues and Julian's friends to endure freezing temperatures and humiliation. I expected Julian to tense. I expected a flash of anger to cross his features, or perhaps an apology for the dismal conditions. Instead, his posture remained loose and unbothered. He looked at the drafty greenhouse, then up at the heated patio. He did not yell. He did not engage with Vanessa's taunt. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his navy suit jacket and pulled out his cell phone. "Give me just a few minutes," he whispered to me, pressing a quick kiss to my temple. He stepped away from the crowd, lifting the phone to his ear. He spoke no more than 3 sentences. His voice was low, decisive, and stripped of any urgency. He slid the phone back into his pocket, returned to my side, and draped his suit jacket over my shoulders to shield the vintage silk from the cold. We waited. The guests shifted on the gravel, exchanging confused glances. The chill seeped through the thin soles of my shoes. Exactly 20 minutes later, a low, synchronized rumble vibrated through the ground. The sound originated from the front of the estate and echoed down the side driveway. Halogen headlights pierced the twilight. 4 imposing, unmarked black luxury catering trucks rolled onto the property. They bypassed the main parking area and navigated the narrow service road, pulling to a precise stop directly behind the glass conservatory. The rear doors of the trucks opened in unison. Out stepped a regiment of 24 servers and culinary staff wearing crisp, tailored black uniforms. I recognized the subtle silver crest embroidered on their lapels. It was the insignia of Boston's premier hospitality fleet. This was the same culinary team that catered private galas for foreign dignitaries and exclusive political fundraisers. They were famous for maintaining a 2-year waiting list. They moved with the calculated efficiency of a military operation. In under 10 minutes, the bleak reality of the greenhouse was entirely overwritten. A crew hauled in 6 towering, silent industrial heating units, placing them strategically in the corners. The bitter chill evaporated, replaced by a deep, luxurious warmth. Another team rolled out thick, plush acoustic carpets over the dirt floor, instantly elevating the space. They erected sleek, high-top tables draped in heavy black velvet. Then came the sensory overload. The smell of dormant fertilizer was banished. Servers moved fluidly through the crowd carrying silver trays. They offered seared Wagyu beef on toasted brioche, truffle-infused risotto bites, and delicate crystal flutes of vintage champagne. The dark skeletal greenhouse transformed into an exclusive, glowing VIP lounge right before our eyes. My guests stopped shivering. They shed their heavy coats, laughing and accepting the premium hors d'oeuvres. I turned to look at the heated stone patio. Vanessa had stopped swirling her hot toddy. Her mouth hung slightly open, her eyes darting between the sleek catering trucks and the crystal centerpieces. My mother gripped the stone balustrade, her knuckles stark white against the dark rock. The executive head chef, a tall man with silver hair and a pristine white jacket, walked into the conservatory. He did not look toward the main house. He ignored Sylvia and Vanessa. He navigated through the crowd of delighted guests and walked straight up to my husband. The chef stopped, offered a deep, respectful bow of his head, and clasped his hands behind his back. "The logistics are fully operational, sir," the chef said, his voice carrying the utmost deference. "We have the reserve wine list, breathing at the mobile bar. Whatever you need, Mr. Mercer, the fleet is yours." I watched my mother's jaw unhinge. Her carefully maintained posture collapsed into a slouch of unadulterated shock. She looked at the chef, then at the fleet of luxury vehicles idling in the driveway, and finally at Julian. The mental ledger in her head short-circuited. I analyzed the expenditure unfolding in front of me. Securing an elite hospitality group on a Saturday night required months of advance notice and a 6-figure deposit. Commanding them to mobilize within 20 minutes required something far more potent than money. It required sovereign industry leverage. Site managers do not have the premier chefs of New England on speed dial. Groundsmen do not command fleets of black luxury trucks to rescue a freezing wedding reception. Julian nodded to the chef, thanking him quietly. He turned his gaze up toward the patio, meeting my mother's terrified stare with a calm, unbreakable focus. The trap Beatrice had laid was dismantled, but the power dynamic shift infuriated the one person who still believed he held the high ground. Inside the heated conservatory, Dr. Pierce watched the Wagyu beef circulate. His fragile ego could not tolerate the sight of my husband commanding respect, prompting the arrogant surgeon to reach for his glass and initiate the final sequence of his own destruction. The miraculous transformation of the freezing greenhouse into a heated, opulent lounge broke the fragile reality my family had constructed. From my vantage point near the center of the conservatory, I watched the panic settle over the stone patio. My mother and Aunt Beatrice huddled together, their whispers frantic and clipped. They shot nervous glances at the fleet of luxury trucks and the elite servers navigating the gravel floor. Their attempt to humiliate Julian had spectacularly backfired. The laborer had outspent and outclassed them with a single phone call. Vanessa recognized the shift in power. Her stolen custom gown looked increasingly absurd as she stood in the bitter cold, watching my guests sip vintage champagne in tropical warmth. She needed to reassert dominance. She needed to remind the room that she was the one marrying a neurosurgeon, while I was merely married to a man who somehow pulled a culinary stunt. She turned to Dr. Pierce, touching his arm and gesturing toward the open doors of the conservatory. Pierce nodded. He descended the stone staircase from the patio and walked into the heated structure. He moved with an exaggerated swagger, projecting a manufactured confidence meant to mask his deep insecurity. He bypassed the servers offering Wagyu beef and positioned himself near the head table where Julian and I sat. Pierce waited until the string quartet finished their set. He reached for a crystal flute of champagne from a passing tray. He tapped a silver spoon against the delicate rim. The sharp, high-pitched ring cut through the low hum of conversation. The guests turned their attention toward him. Pierce adjusted the collar of his suit jacket. He made a deliberate show of checking the time on his rented Rolex, ensuring the heavy gold watch caught the ambient lighting. He offered the room a magnanimous, patronizing grin. "I would like to propose a quick toast to the happy couple," Pierce announced. His voice was loud, carrying the specific cadence of a man accustomed to issuing orders in an operating theater. He raised his glass toward Julian. Julian sat relaxed in his chair, his broad shoulders resting comfortably against the velvet backing. He watched Pierce with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable reaction. It truly is inspiring to see two people appreciate the simple things in life. Pierce continued, his tone dripping with condescension. He paced slowly in front of our table, playing to the crowd of my mother and aunt who had gathered near the entrance. Some of us carry the heavy burden of managing significant wealth. We deal with the pressure of high-stakes investments and the demands of saving lives on a daily basis. It can be exhausting. But I have to admit, there is a certain rustic charm in a man whose greatest concern is deciding which direction to mow the lawn. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the back of the room, originating from the relatives my aunt had invited to witness our degradation. Vanessa smirked from the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. My mother offered a tight, approving nod. They believed Pierce was restoring the natural order. They believed he was stripping away the glamour of the elite catering fleet by reminding everyone that Julian was fundamentally just a dirt-covered laborer. Pierce took a slow sip of his champagne, savoring his perceived victory. "To Liliana and Julian, may your grass always be green and your trailer park always be quiet." I did not flush with anger. My vision did not tunnel. I felt a profound, chilling stillness settle into my bones. For 6 months, I had absorbed their insults. I had allowed them to mock my fiancé, steal my dress, and banish my guests to an unheated shed. I had honored Julian's request at the rehearsal dinner to let them dig their own graves. The grave was deep enough. It was time to push the dirt in. I picked up my own crystal flute. I stood up from my chair. The heavy vintage silk of my great-grandmother's gown rustled against the floorboards. I picked up a silver dessert spoon and tapped it against the glass. The sound was softer than Pierce's, but it commanded immediate, total silence within the acoustic walls of the conservatory. I looked directly at the neurosurgeon. His patronizing smile remained fixed on his face, expecting me to offer a meek, humiliated acknowledgement of his toast. "Thank you, Dr. Pierce," I said. My voice projected with crystal-clear precision, hitting every corner of the room. It truly is a heavy burden managing wealth. I deal with those burdens every single day in my profession. I audit the ledgers of men who pretend to be titans while drowning in their own liabilities. Pierce's smile faltered by a fraction of an inch. His brow furrowed in confusion. "I imagine the burden of wealth management is especially difficult for you," I continued, my tone entirely conversational. The room held its breath. The silence was absolute, especially when your surgical malpractice insurance premiums have skyrocketed due to 3 undisclosed out-of-court settlements. It must be exhausting trying to maintain a luxury lifestyle when the insurance consortium garnishes 80% of your clinical wages before you even see a paycheck. The blood drained from Pierce's face. The flush of alcohol vanished, replaced by a sickly, pale hue. He lowered his champagne flute, his hand trembling so violently the liquid sloshed over the rim and spilled onto his pristine cuffs. "What are you talking about?" Pierce stammered. His voice was thin and reedy. "This is absurd. You are making up lies because you are embarrassed by your husband." "I am a forensic accountant, Pierce. I do not deal in lies. I deal in public records and verified tax liens." I took a slow step forward, closing the distance between us. I wanted him to look into my eyes and see the exact shape of his ruin. The burden of wealth is heavy indeed, especially when your luxury Back Bay condo went into pre-foreclosure last Tuesday. A sharp, collective gasp erupted from the doorway. Vanessa dropped her ceramic mug onto the stone patio. It shattered, sending hot liquid pooling around her designer heels. She stared at Pierce, her eyes wide with shock and horror. My aunt clutched her chest, struggling to process the reality that the golden child of her social strategy was insolvent. "You are a fraud, Pierce," I stated calmly. I did not yell. I did not need to raise my voice to dismantle his life. The facts possessed their own gravity. "I am opening the ledger right here in front of Boston's elite. You lease your cars. You rent your watches. Your entire existence is built on high-interest, predatory, bad debt. You are marrying Vanessa to secure access to her mother's estate because you are entirely bankrupt." Pierce opened his mouth to formulate a defense, but his vocal cords failed him. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an ally. He found none. The society guests, the people he had spent years trying to impress, were staring at him with unvarnished disgust. He was exposed. Vanessa pushed her way through the crowd, her face twisted into a mask of pure rage. She did not direct her fury at the man who had lied to her. She directed it at me. She marched toward the head table, her stolen custom gown swishing violently around her legs. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at my chest. "Take it off," Vanessa screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Take off that vintage gown right now. That dress belongs to my mother. She is the primary heir. You have no right to wear it after the scene you just caused. You are disinherited. Hand over the silk, or I will strip it off you myself." Before Vanessa could close the final few feet between us, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the conservatory swung open with a resounding thud. The commotion halted instantly. The crowd parted, creating a wide aisle toward the entrance. A tall man with silver hair at his temples walked into the heated lounge, flanked by 2 imposing private security guards. My mother and Aunt Beatrice completely forgot about the stolen dress, the exposed surgeon, and the ruined reception. Their social conditioning kicked in with automated precision. They recognized the man walking through the door. It was Marcus Holden, the billionaire real estate mogul who controlled half the commercial property in Massachusetts. Sylvia and Beatrice had spent 3 years desperately trying to secure a 5-minute meeting with him to pitch an investment for their country club. Beatrice rushed forward, plastering a desperate, ingratiating smile onto her face. She extended her hand, ready to fawn over the titan who had unexpectedly graced her property. She had no idea that Marcus Holden was not here to evaluate her estate. He was here to deliver a folder to my husband, a transaction that would permanently erase my aunt's name from the deed of the very ground she stood upon. Aunt Beatrice practically tripped over the hem of her designer skirt in her rush to intercept the billionaire at the door. For years, she had campaigned to secure an invitation to Marcus Holden's annual charity gala, believing his endorsement was the final credential required to cement her status among the Boston elite. Now the mogul was standing inside her unheated, repurposed greenhouse. The desperation radiating from my aunt was palpable. She smoothed her hair plastered on a wide, artificial grin and thrust her manicured hand forward. Mr. Holden, Beatrice gasped, her voice pitched unnaturally high.
What an absolute honor to welcome you to my home. We had no idea you were on the guest list. Please allow me to have the staff fetch you a glass of our reserve champagne.
Marcus Holden did not stop walking. He did not slow his pace, and he did not extend his hand to accept her greeting. He looked right through Beatrice, as if she were a piece of translucent furniture obstructing his path. His security detail seamlessly stepped forward, creating a physical barrier that forced my aunt to stumble backward into the crowd of stunned society guests. Holden navigated the center aisle of the conservatory with the focused intensity of a man executing a high-priority transaction. His eyes scanned the room, bypassing the crystal centerpieces, the elite servers, and the panicked neurosurgeon trembling near the head table. Holden locked his gaze on the man sitting quietly in the velvet chair. He walked straight up to my husband. The billionaire mogul, a man whose net worth regularly dominated the covers of financial publications, stopped in front of the supposed dirt-covered laborer. Holden unbuttoned his suit jacket, offered a deep, respectful nod, and extended his hand. Julian Holden said, his voice carrying the deep timbre of authentic professional reverence. I apologize profoundly for interrupting your wedding reception. I would not have intruded on your personal time, but the escrow parameters on the Seaport waterfront acquisition cleared an hour ago. The regional bank finalized the transfer of the distressed debt portfolios. We require your physical signature to execute the final consolidation before the market opens on Monday. Julian did not appear startled by the interruption. He accepted the handshake with a firm, practiced grip. He stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his navy suit. Do not apologize, Marcus Julian replied smoothly. A successful closure requires prompt execution. Do you have the physical documents? Holden snapped his fingers. One of the security guards stepped forward and produced a thick, leather-bound legal portfolio. He unzipped the case and handed a silver fountain pen to my husband. The interaction played out in stark, agonizing clarity in front of my family. My mother and Aunt Beatrice stood paralyzed. Their brains lacked the necessary circuitry to process the visual data. The apex predator of their financial ecosystem was standing in front of Julian Mercer, acting as a subordinate courier, asking for authorization to complete a multi-million-dollar real estate acquisition. Sylvia broke the silence. She stepped out from the crowd, her face a mask of absolute bewilderment. She pointed a trembling finger at Julian. "Mr. Holden," my mother stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "There must be some sort of profound misunderstanding. You have the wrong man. Julian is not involved in commercial acquisitions. He works outside. He is a landscaper." Marcus Holden paused. He turned his head, slowly assessing my mother, with a mixture of profound confusion and deep pity. He looked at Julian, raising a single gray eyebrow in silent inquiry. Julian merely offered a small dismissive shrug, returning his attention to the legal documents in the portfolio. Holden turned his focus back to my mother. He let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter that echoed off the glass panes of the conservatory. A landscaper Holden repeated, shaking his head. "Madam Julian Mercer does not mow lawns. Julian is the founder and chief executive officer of Mercer Holdings. He owns the largest commercial land development and ecological restoration firm on the eastern seaboard. He controls the zoning rights to half the commercial districts in Massachusetts. He practically owns the soil you are standing on. The room tilted on its axis. The audible gasp that rippled through the crowd was not a polite, restrained murmur. It was the sound of a structural collapse. The society guests, the people who had sneered at Julian's scuffed boots during the rehearsal dinner, suddenly realized they had spent the past 2 days actively mocking a titan who possessed the leverage to ruin their respective careers. I watched the math violently recalculate in my mother's eyes. The 6-month campaign of psychological warfare she had waged against us unraveled in a matter of seconds. She had relegated a billionaire to a drafty greenhouse. She had refused to pay for his catering. She had stolen his bride's custom gown to dress a cousin marrying an insolvent, fraudulent surgeon. She had written off the CEO of Mercer Holdings as a blue-collar charity case because he preferred the authenticity of a denim shirt over the manufactured prestige of a rented Rolex. Aunt Beatrice gripped the edge of a high-top table to keep her balance. The illusion of her grand high society legacy shattered around her feet. She looked at Vanessa standing rigid in the stolen dress. She looked at Dr. Pierce, sweating profusely, exposed as a financial parasite. And then she looked at Julian, the man she had barred from her pristine Maine house. Julian flipped to the final page of the acquisition portfolio. He uncapped the silver fountain pen and signed his name with a swift, decisive motion. He handed the leather binder back to Holden. "The transfer is complete," Marcus Julian said, his tone shifting into the crisp cadence of an executive. "Integrate the prime residential assets into our core portfolio. Liquidate the non-performing commercial debt by the end of the quarter." Holden nodded, accepting the binder. "Understood, Julian. Congratulations on the marriage. I will see you in the boardroom on Tuesday." Holden turned, flanked by his security detail, and marched back out the heavy wooden doors, leaving a wake of absolute devastation in his path. The silence that followed was suffocating. The elite catering staff paused their service, standing still near the perimeter of the room. The string quartet lowered their bows. Every eye in the conservatory remained fixed on Julian. He slipped his pen back into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and turned his attention toward my aunt. The final ledger remained unbalanced. My exposure of Pierce's fraudulent debt had severed his connection to Vanessa, and Holden's arrival had shattered my family's social illusions. But Beatrice still believed she possessed a fundamental safety net. She believed she was standing inside a structure she owned. She believed the sprawling Wellesley estate provided her with an untouchable sanctuary, a fortress she could retreat into once the guests departed. Julian walked slowly around the head table. He stopped a few feet away from Beatrice. His expression held zero malice, only the cold, unyielding reality of a verified transaction. "Speaking of commercial debt," Beatrice Julian said. His voice was low, carrying a terrifying authority that pinned her in place. "Since we are finalizing ledgers today, I believe it is time we discuss the specific nature of the mortgage attached to this estate." The heavy oak doors of the conservatory had clicked shut behind Marcus Holden, but the draft of cold air he let in seemed to linger, chilling the sweat on the foreheads of my relatives. The string quartet remained silent. The elite catering staff stood at attention along the perimeter of the glass walls, their silver trays resting at their sides. Everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see what the billionaire who preferred dirt to boardrooms would do next. Julian did not gloat. He did not puff out his chest or raise his voice to demand an apology for the months of mockery he had endured. A true executive does not need to demand respect once the leverage is verified. He simply pivoted his stance, turning away from the exit and focusing his cold steel gaze squarely on Aunt Beatrice. Beatrice was still gripping the edge of the velvet-draped high-top table. Her knuckles matched the pale, sickly shade of her face. She looked like a captain who had just realized the ocean was swallowing the deck of her ship. "Speaking of commercial real estate," Beatrice Julian said. His tone was conversational, yet it carried a terrifying, unyielding authority that pinned her in place. Since we are in the process of finalizing ledgers today, I believe it is time we discuss the specific nature of the mortgage attached to this estate. The word mortgage dropped into the quiet greenhouse like a stone into a still pond. My mother stepped forward, her maternal instincts momentarily overriding her shock. She inserted herself between Julienne and her sister, lifting her chin to project a defensive, aristocratic pride she no longer possessed. "There is no mortgage," Sylvia stated, her voice tight and defensive. "You may have fooled us regarding your corporate portfolio, Julienne, but you will not stand here and fabricate lies about my family. This house is paid off. My mother purchased this property decades ago with authentic capital. It belongs to Beatrice, free and clear. It is a family sanctuary." I stepped out from behind the head table. The heavy, museum-quality silk of my great-grandmother's vintage gown rustled against the acoustic carpet, a soft sound that drew every eye in the room toward me. I opened my leather clutch and reached inside. My fingers brushed past the printed default notices and closed around the cold metal of Abuela Carmen's legacy. I pulled out the dull brass key. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the warm glow of the industrial heaters catch the worn edges of the metal. "It was paid off," I said, keeping my gaze locked on my mother, "until your sister decided to treat a family sanctuary like a personal automated teller machine." Sylvia frowned, her eyes darting from my face to the key in my hand. "You told me that was a locker key," she whispered, the certainty draining from her posture. "You said it was a piece of junk." "I told you it belonged to Abuela," I corrected her gently. "You were the one who labeled it garbage. You demanded I take it off because it ruined your pristine aesthetic. You lacked the vision to realize Abuela did not hand down useless hardware. This key unlocks a safety deposit box at a historic bank in the financial district, a box I visited just a few days ago." I turned my attention to Beatrice. My aunt was trembling now. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She knew exactly what I had found. The forensic trail was no longer buried in the shadows. It was walking into the light. "Abuela Carmen knew your hunger for status would eventually bankrupt you," I said, addressing my aunt with the clinical detachment of an auditor delivering a final report. "She knew you would sell off every piece of our history to buy your way into the country club. That is why she never left the deed of this estate to you. She placed the property into an irrevocable blind trust. You were permitted to live here, Beatrice, but you never owned a single brick of this mansion. You were just a tenant." The society guests murmured the scandal too delicious to ignore. A prominent local politician whispered something to his wife. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look at the peers she had spent her life trying to impress. "But a tenant cannot take out a loan against a property." I continued pacing slowly across the front of the room. "You needed liquid capital to fund Vanessa's lifestyle and to prop up Dr. Pierce's failing medical practice. So you committed fiduciary fraud. You forged the trust authorization documents. You presented yourself to secondary lending institutions as the sole proprietor, and you leveraged the Wellesley estate to secure 3 staggering high-yield lines of credit." Vanessa let out a sharp, choked sob. The golden child of the family looked down at her stolen custom wedding dress. The $10,000 silk suddenly felt like a prison uniform. She was wrapped in stolen fabric, engaged to a surgeon who was drowning in malpractice debt. Standing in a greenhouse her mother had illegally mortgaged. Her entire identity was a curated lie. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as the tears ruined her professional makeup. Sylvia physically recoiled from her sister. The invisible tether that had bound them together for 30 years snapped. My mother had worshipped Beatrice. She had followed her older sister's social playbook to the letter, abandoning our Dorchester roots to chase the illusion of Wellesley royalty. Now she realized she had tethered her loyalty to a criminal. "You forged the documents." Sylvia breathed, her voice hollow. "You put our mother's house in jeopardy to buy imported orchids and country club lunches." "I did not put it in jeopardy," Beatrice snapped, her eyes snapping open, desperate to maintain a shred of her dignity. "It was a temporary liquidity issue. I was going to pay the lenders back as soon as Pierce secured his surgical partnership." I turned toward the trembling surgeon. Pierce was staring at the gravel floor, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Pierce is insolvent, I reminded her. He was waiting for your wealth to save him, while you were waiting for his future earnings to save you. It was a closed loop of financial ruin. The math failed, Beatrice. You missed 6 consecutive payments. The secondary lenders realized they were holding toxic paper. The bank formally foreclosed on the Wellesley estate weeks ago. You do not have a temporary liquidity issue. You are commercially bankrupt. The finality of the word echoed through the glass walls. Bankrupt. It was the ultimate curse word in their vocabulary, far worse than any profanity. It was the total liquidation of their social existence. Beatrice released her grip on the table. She swayed, looking like a woman standing at the edge of a steep cliff, feeling the ground crumble beneath her designer shoes. She looked at me, then at Julian, her eyes wide and bloodshot. If the bank foreclosed, Beatrice choked out her voice, barely a whisper. If the property went to a private auction, who bought the debt? Who holds the paper? Julian stepped forward. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply delivered the final calculation with the precision of a blade. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, placing one hand in his pocket. The gesture was casual, yet it projected total dominion over the space. When regional lenders realize they have overextended their risk on fraudulent property loans, they bundle that bad debt and sell it to corporate holding companies at a steep discount, Julian explained. The tone he used was identical to the one I had overheard him use in his Seaport boardroom. My acquisition firm specializes in purchasing distressed portfolios in the New England area. Marcus Holden just delivered the final escrow verifications. Mercer Holdings purchased the exact portfolio containing your defaulted loans last month. Beatrice stared at him, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Julian looked around the perimeter of the room, taking in the rusted wrought iron framework, the single-pane glass, and the heated stone patio just beyond the doors. Which means, as of right now, Julian said, holding my aunt's gaze, I own this estate. I own the main house you locked us out of. I own the unheated conservatory you tried to hide my wife in. I own the very ground you are standing on. The trap had snapped shut. My family had spent 6 months treating Julian Mercer like a peasant who was privileged just to breathe the air on their property. Now they were standing inside a building he legally possessed, exposed as fraudulent tenants with zero capital to their names. The power dynamic had been entirely rewritten. And as the reality of their downfall settled over the frozen faces of my mother, my aunt, and my cousin Julian, prepared to issue his first and final directive as their new landlord. The echo of Julian's declaration settled over the conservatory, sinking into the damp earth beneath the acoustic carpets. I own the very ground you are standing on. The words possessed a weight that shattered the remaining fragments of my aunt's curated reality. Beatrice released her white-knuckled grip on the high-top table. Her shoulders slumped forward, her impeccable posture collapsing under the crushing gravity of her financial ruin. She did not attempt to argue. She did not threaten to call her lawyers. When a predator realizes they have walked willingly into a steel trap, they stop fighting the jaws. They simply stare at the metal. My mother took a slow, unsteady step backward. Sylvia looked at the sister she had idolized for 3 decades. She had abandoned her Dorchester heritage, discarded her own daughter, and compromised her moral compass, all to secure a position in a kingdom that turned out to be a mirage. Sylvia looked down at her designer shoes resting on the gravel, realizing she had traded her authentic family for a handful of forged deeds and defaulted loans. Vanessa remained frozen near the patio doorway. The $10,000 custom silk gown she had stolen from my bridal suite dragged in the dirt. The dress was designed for a triumphant ballroom entrance, not a commercial eviction. She hugged her arms across her chest, shivering as the draft from the glass panes cut through the thin fabric. Beside her, Dr. Pierce stared blankly at the crystal champagne flute in his trembling hand. The arrogant neurosurgeon was processing a profound, terrifying equation. He had alienated his peers, exposed his malpractice garnishments, and tied himself to a family that possessed less capital than he did. He had nowhere to go. His condo was repossessed. His future mother-in-law was destitute. His golden ticket was worthless. Julian turned away from Beatrice and looked down at me. The cold, unyielding executive persona dissolved, replaced by the gentle, grounding presence of the man I loved. He reached out and took my hand. His calluses felt warm and familiar against my skin. He laced his fingers through mine, anchoring me in the center of the room. "Miliana invited you here today, hoping you would simply act like family," Julian said, addressing the 4 figures huddled near the exit. His voice carried no anger, only the sterile finality of an auditor closing a corrupted ledger. "She endured your insults. She allowed you to relegate her guests to an unheated shed. She gave you every opportunity to value her above your social ambitions. But you chose to act like creditors instead. You viewed her as a liability, and you viewed me as a bad investment." Julian paused, letting the silence amplify his verdict. "So we are foreclosing on the relationship." He did not raise his voice to call for security. He merely shifted his gaze toward the perimeter of the room and offered a subtle, decisive nod to the executive head chef. The elite catering staff, the men and women my aunt had treated like invisible servants all evening, moved with synchronized precision. They set their silver trays down on the velvet-draped tables. 4 servers stepped forward, walking in a uniform line toward my mother, my aunt, my cousin, and the ruined surgeon. They did not carry trays of Wagyu beef or crystal flutes. Each server held a thick, heavy-duty, black plastic garbage bag. They stopped in front of the frozen quartet. The head chef approached Aunt Beatrice. He offered the same polite, deferential bow he had given Julian earlier in the evening. His face was a mask of perfect professional courtesy. "To pack your personal items from the bridal suite," the chef said, extending the folded black plastic toward her. "The estate must be vacated immediately, per the new owner's instructions." It was the ultimate stroke of poetic justice. The high society matriarchs who had spent their entire lives running from the stigma of poverty were standing in front of Boston's elite, being handed trash bags by the working-class staff they despised. Beatrice stared at the black plastic as if it were a venomous snake. She refused to take it. Sylvia reached out with a trembling manicured hand and accepted the bag, her face flushed with a deep, consuming shame. Vanessa let out another choked sob, refusing to touch the plastic, leaving Pierce to clumsily take the remaining bags from the servers. The private security detail that had accompanied Marcus Holden materialized from the shadows of the estate grounds. They wore dark overcoats and earpieces, their presence leaving zero room for negotiation. The lead guard stepped past the chef and gestured toward the open doors of the conservatory. "It is time to leave," the guard instructed, his tone firm and uncompromising. "We will escort you to the main house to collect your belongings, and then you will be escorted off the premises." Beatrice opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat. She looked past the guards, searching the crowd for a sympathetic face. She looked toward the society columnists, the country club board members, and the local politicians she had invited. She expected them to rally to her defense. She expected her elite network to shield her from the humiliation. Instead, the guests turned their backs. The politicians engaged in sudden, intense conversations with their spouses. The country club members examined the acoustic carpets. The society columnists typed furiously on their mobile phones, already drafting the sensational downfall of the Wellesley estate. In the world of high society, nothing is more contagious than a financial default. My aunt was a social pariah, and her former friends were desperate to avoid the quarantine zone. The security guards ushered them out. I watched my family walk through the heavy wooden doors and step out into the freezing Massachusetts night. The wind whipped across the patio, tearing at Vanessa's stolen silk train and biting through Pierce's thin suit jacket. They trudged across the bluestone terrace, their heads bowed against the cold, carrying their empty black garbage bags. They were stripped of their leverage. Their deep secrets were exposed to the public, and their entire social standing was permanently liquidated. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them, sealing out the bitter wind. Inside the conservatory, the industrial heaters hummed, bathing the room in a rich, tropical warmth. The oppressive tension that had choked the air for the past 6 months evaporated. A collective exhale rippled through the remaining crowd. The true friends, the project managers, the forensic accountants, and the site engineers raised their glasses. Julian turned to the string quartet who were watching the exit with wide eyes. "Play something upbeat." Julian requested a genuine, relaxed smile spreading across his face. "We have a wedding to celebrate." The cellist grinned, launching into a lively, vibrant tempo. The catering staff resumed their service, circulating the reserve wine and the premium hors d'oeuvres. The room filled with genuine laughter, the kind of joy that only exists when the air is cleared of pretense. Julian pulled me into the center of the floor. He wrapped his arms around my waist, drawing me close. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat. The heavy vintage silk of my great-grandmother's gown swayed as we moved together, the intricate Chantilly lace catching the warm glow of the ambient lights. I did not feel like a forensic accountant balancing a difficult book. I felt light. I felt free. The deficit was erased, and the account was permanently closed. Life moves forward. The seasons change, and the ledgers turn over to a new fiscal year. My mother still tries to call me, usually on the first Sunday of every month. She leaves long, tearful voicemails talking about forgiveness, family bonds, and unfortunate misunderstandings. I do not delete the messages, but I do not listen to them either. I file them into a digital folder on my phone that I never check. Vanessa's engagement to the neurosurgeon dissolved the moment the society pages published the details of his insolvency and her mother's commercial foreclosure. They turned on each other, two drowning people fighting over a deflated life raft. Julian and I still live a quiet life. He continues to run Mercer Holdings from his Seaport high-rise, but he still comes home with soil on his boots and the scent of cedar on his skin. I still work in my glass office, tracing hidden numbers and identifying the structural rot people try to conceal. That is my story. A stolen dress, a hidden ledger, and a family that measured my worth by the wrong metrics. They assumed value was determined by a retail price tag and a prestigious address. They failed to realize that true wealth is built on a foundation that cannot be foreclosed upon. I often think about the cold air rushing through those heavy oak doors. When I picture my mother and my aunt standing in the freezing Massachusetts night, clutching black plastic garbage bags that held the remnants of their shattered vanity, I do not feel a fleeting sense of triumphant vindication. Instead, I feel a profound, lingering melancholy. Because the collapse of the Wellesley estate was not simply a financial foreclosure or a dramatic twist of fate at a wedding reception. At its core, it was the ultimate, devastating bankruptcy of a mother's duty to her child. In American culture, we are so often sold a very specific, highly polished version of success. We are taught from a young age to chase the upward trajectory, to hustle tirelessly, climbing from a cramped duplex in Dorchester to a sprawling, manicured mansion in the suburbs. That ambition, in its purest, most traditional form, is the beautiful engine of the family dream. It is the fundamental desire to provide for your offspring, to offer your children a better, more secure life than the one you inherited. But somewhere along that steep climb, my mother Sylvia and my Aunt Beatrice lost the map entirely. They confused the appearance of a better life with the substance of one. They began to view parenting not as the sacred, lifelong responsibility of guiding a human soul, but as a ruthless exercise in public relations and portfolio management. Look closely at my cousin Vanessa. It is incredibly easy to view her merely as a bitter antagonist wrapped in a stolen silk gown. But the truth of her existence is far more tragic. Vanessa was the victim of a mother who prioritized aesthetics over character. Aunt Beatrice did not provide her daughter with long-term guidance or the emotional tools necessary to navigate the complexities of the real world. Instead, Vanessa was raised to be a showpiece, a human credential meant to validate her mother's desperate social climbing. She was taught that honesty was secondary to optics and that fairness was merely an obstacle to winning the neighborhood's approval. Beatrice did not prepare her daughter for the profound realities of a true partnership, nor did she instill the resilient grace required to build a lasting marriage. She handed Vanessa a stolen dress and tethered her to a fraudulent surgeon, sending her out into the harsh world wearing armor made of tissue paper. That is the devastating cost of raising a child without emotional awareness. You raise an adult who does not know how to survive the rain because they were only ever taught how to pose in the sun. Then I look at how my own mother treated me. Sylvia attempted to write me off as a social liability simply because I loved a man who worked with his hands. She lacked the emotional intelligence to see that Julian's calluses were a testament to his unbreakable character, not a deduction from his worth. In a traditional family structure, a parent's primary job is to be the solid, unyielding soil in which their child's roots can safely anchor. But when parents evaluate their children through the lens of a social return on investment, the soil becomes toxic. You cannot demand enduring loyalty from a child you have only ever treated as a transaction. Authentic love requires fairness. It requires the emotional capacity to see your child clearly, to validate their authentic choices, and to stand by them with unwavering support, even when those choices do not yield a front-page photograph in the society columns. When you measure your child's worth by their zip code, you do not elevate your family. You simply evict their trust. True family responsibility, the kind that endures generations and weathers the harshest storms, looks entirely different. It looks like my abuela Carmen. She was a woman who scrubbed commercial floors until her joints ached and her hands bled. Yet she possessed a wealth of character her daughters never grasped. Abuela understood that the most valuable inheritance you can leave your descendants is not a blind trust, a vintage gown, or a country club membership. It is the brass key of uncompromising integrity. It is the quiet, unshakable knowledge that your foundation is built on honest ground. She hid the true deed to the estate not out of malice, but out of a desperate hope that at least one of her descendants would value truth over a facade. She provided long-term guidance from beyond the grave, teaching me that self-worth is something you build with your own two hands, never something you borrow from a bank. She demonstrated that true American success is not about escaping your working-class roots, but about honoring the honest labor that paved the way for your ascent. It takes a lifetime to unlearn the flawed metrics of a broken family to rewire the way we measure love, loyalty, and success. If my journey has resonated with you, if you have ever had to rebuild your own sense of worth from the ground up after the people who were supposed to protect you tried to tear it down, please know that you are not alone. There is an entire community of us who have learned to audit the emotional ledgers of our lives, cutting away the liabilities to make room for authentic growth. I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Revenge Order. Drop a comment below about the foundational lessons you are fighting to pass on to the next generation, and become part of a space where we always value truth over the illusion. Now, sitting in the quiet warmth of my own home, I sometimes pull that dull brass key from my jewelry box and trace its worn edges. I look out the window at the distant city lights and think about the parents who are still out there tonight, sitting at grand dining tables, teaching their children how to smile perfectly for the cameras, while the floorboards rot silently beneath their feet. Parenting ultimately is the longest and most unforgiving ledger we will ever keep. Every word of genuine encouragement is a deposit. Every unfair comparison is a withdrawal. Long after the grand estates are auctioned off and the custom silk gowns fade into memory, the only thing that remains is the math of how we made our children feel. I managed to balance my own books and find my peace, but I cannot help but look out into the darkening sky and wonder, when the final audit of your own family eventually arrives, what exactly will your children find hidden in the vault?